What's happening, folks? Welcome back to the 182 News YouTube page. Appreciate you checking out this video. Today, I want to talk about an album that I have been looking forward to for so long from one of my favorite bands, Neck Deep. I am a huge Neck Deep fan. I was so stoked to hear this new album was coming out. It's apparently a return to pop punk roots, and I was stoked to dive into it. Now, before I get into the album and some of my thoughts surrounding the tracks and rollout, I want to make sure everybody's on the same page as far as leading up to the new album, some of the things that have transpired, because I think it's important. So if we look at their last album, their fourth studio album was All Distortions Are Intentional. And this was a departure from some of the earlier sounds that some of the fan base was used to. I love this album. And I know in some interviews, I'll probably touch on it a little bit later, but I know the band is kind of hard on themselves on this album. It was certainly a departure from Life's Not Out to Get You, The Peace and the Panic, but to me, it was warranted. And as artists, they obviously felt like they wanted to explore new sounds, new avenues. It was a concept album, really tells a story of a character named Jet that was essentially Ben being able to put his feelings on kind of a third-party character to tell a story throughout the album. I honestly feel it's a masterpiece. It kind of bums me out that the band isn't super high on it, but I think some of the stuff that also plays a factor there it was rolled out during COVID. The touring was just shattered. I mean, I just think when they think back to that time period, it's probably not the best vibes. And then, of course, the fan base also really wanted some pop punk sounds. That's kind of what you've come to expect out of Neck Deep, is just bringing that heat. So while the band seems, a little low on it, and obviously that ties into this return to true pop punk form on the new album, I think it's important to note that at that point in their career, this came out in 2020, the band formed in 2012, they had had several albums underneath their belt at that point, and I felt like they deserved to explore whatever sounds they want. It's interesting. Obviously, this is a Blink page. A lot of you listen to the Blink podcast. I can kind of liken it to essentially, say Life's Not Out to Get You, which is really where they kind of rose to fame and went out on Warped Tour and really just started to be on the scene as pop punk kings at that point. I kind of liken it to Blink blowing up with Enema. Obviously the sales may be a little bit different, but to me, you say Life's Not Out to Get You is like their Enema, where they blow up. All of a sudden, most people know about them. Obviously well known in the scene. They follow that up, Blink does, with Take Off Your Pants and Jacket. Neck Deep follows that up with The Peace and the Panic. Still very much pop punk, however, maybe a little bit darker. Songwriting's a little bit different, maturing a little bit. It's interesting, the trajectory there for both of those when I think about them side by side. And then at that point in Blink's world, they move on to Untitled, which is a very, very, exploratory sound. I've said this on my podcast before, but if you give somebody Untitled from Blink, who only knows Blink from Cheshire Cat or Buddha in 1993, 1994, they may think it's a different band. But it's a band that's maturing. It's a band that was established. And you get to the point of, as an artist, where you probably need to explore different sounds just for your own creative process and sanity. So to me, that's a long way of saying that All Distortions Are Intentional, to me, felt very natural. I had no issues with it. It may not have been as popular as they thought, and I think maybe the concept album in and of itself, maybe that kind of flew over some people's heads who really just want 2.5-minute pop punk bangers, on a sunny day on Warped Tour out of this band. But I don't think that anything was wrong with that. So at that point, the album came out. They did have to push their tour because of COVID. They did eventually get out. But there were also some significant changes between that album and this one 4 years later. Most notably, Seb Barlow, Ben's older brother, he joins the band full-time as a bassist. Touring bassist. I mean, he is in the band, and Seb is someone who I would love to get him on the podcast and chat with him. I don't think a lot of people realize it, but he has been there since day one. I mean, he has said Neck Deep is essentially his baby. It started in his room. There's a rad history, a lot of story there that I don't think a lot of people are familiar with. that I really want to bring out in a conversation at some point. And then also, Danny Washington leaves the band, who was their drummer forever since the beginning, essentially. So we've got some new members in. I think both fits right there were very natural. Seb's been in the background of the band the whole time. I love to see him joining the band, actually getting to go out on the road with them, enjoy the shows, enjoy playing the music live. And then you've got a new drummer coming in who wasn't officially a part of the band for some time, but it's Matt Powles, who you may or may not know was their drum tech since around 2015. So even though it kind of felt like new people were in, per se, and you might be kind of worried from a songwriting or sound perspective where they may go, I actually found comfort in knowing that these people have been around the whole time. Like, this is awesome. I feel like we are truly in a new, wholesome era of Neck Deep, and they're all there, and I just heard Ben say it on an interview yesterday. They all want the same things. They're all down for the touring, down to play these shows, make these albums, and keep up with, the cycles necessary when you're doing this type of thing. And so for everybody to be committed and happy and friends and everything, just looks awesome. Like, from an outsider, obviously I don't know too much about the inner workings of the band, but I was stoked for this new era. And to me, that was kind of my takeaway. After all that happened, Distortions come out, a couple members leave. This is a new era of Neck Deep. And I was very curious to hear, what is the new stuff going to sound like? Are they going to stick with an experimental sound? Are they going to go back to their pop punk roots, per se? And as we started getting closer to a release, I had seen and read that more or less they were going to go back to their pop punk roots. And I think All Distortions was something that they just needed to get out of themselves creatively. And the first really drop that we got, or hint of that, was STFU, Shut the Fuck Up. And when that song came out, I was blown away. That was an absolute banger. And I was thinking, oh my, if this new era even just gets close to sticking to this sound, it's going to be unreal. And that was a single, that was in 2022, kind of our first taste of where this new era may take us. And it took some time for the next song to drop. They kind of rode that. They went out on Sad Summerfest. I caught them live that summer. It was rad. And then the next song, as we started really kind of getting into, okay, they're going to work on an album, was Heartbreak of the Century. And this is one that, for me, I was actually in that music video. It was awesome. Like, they put up a roll call for everybody to just submit your name, and you could be a part of the music video. It was near me. So I drove down there. I think that was November 2022-ish. When I first heard that song. So I've heard that song for such a long time. It eventually came out that February. And between that and STFU, I was thinking, oh my God, they are back with this pop punk sound, but it's progressive, it's bangers. And from those two alone, I was thinking, okay, I'm ready for these dudes to get in the studio and write a new album. And there was also some things happening at that time that I've heard them say in recent interviews actually kind of pushed them and made them appreciate that original sound kind of that they had and became popular with. And it was the Rain in July 10th year anniversary shows. And they did some of these no barrier small shows. And Ben had said that really those kind of reminded them of where they came from. So there's multiple factors here. You take into account they weren't super stoked maybe with how Distortions went over with the fan base, or maybe even how they felt about it afterwards. And then you also have how rad they feel at these shows going back to their pop punk roots. And so I think it was just a perfect culmination of, all right, let's do a pop punk record. Let's do what we're best known for. Let's do what we're good at. At this point, it doesn't seem like it, but they're veterans in the game. So they know what they're doing on this stuff. They decided to more or less go back to their pop punk roots and start working on a new album. Now, something here that's really interesting to me is apparently they went out and recorded with some producer out in LA. So during that time period, they had re-signed with Hopeless. They were independent for a little bit, but they re-signed with Hopeless. They decided they're going to start working on a new album, fly out to LA, start working on it. And what's fascinating to me is it apparently just wasn't working out. And a lot of people think that maybe they scrapped all the songs or it just wasn't that. But more or less what I've kind of picked up on is maybe it just wasn't sounding the way that they wanted it to sound. And maybe the composition or suggestions or whatever they were getting from the unnamed producer or production team weren't necessarily vibing with what they wanted to put out. And so they made a big decision. And this is something that I'm glad they're at the point in their career where they could do that, because I'm sure it wasn't taken lightly either way. It's a lot of money. These dudes are overseas, traveling over to sit in LA and, work with a producer. I'm sure that's not cheap. But ultimately, they decided that they didn't like how this was going, and they wanted to do it themselves. And so at that point, they made the decision to go back home. They have a new studio warehouse, is my understanding. And basically, Seb, this is where it's super, super important. Seb's still involved. Seb's still in the band, part of the band now. And they essentially just did it on their own. And so when I heard that Seb had taken back over and they were working on the production in-house, I'm like, okay, that takes a lot of balls from a band. But, they've been in this long enough that they can make that decision. And I'm happy they did. And obviously, we're going to get to this album very, very soon. It's amazing. And the production is absolutely amazing. So they go home. They're working in a more natural environment. Thankfully they have Seb in the band. I've heard him and Ben talk about how they're almost telepathic in that if they're trying to explain something and maybe no outsiders or no outsider producer would understand what point they're trying to make or what sound they're trying to get to. But this is kind of the inner workings of a band that's rad. And I like diving into this kind of thing is, Ben and Seb being brothers, growing up together, growing up with the same music, they just know. Like when they hear something, I heard them say their eyebrows kind of peek up like, oh, that's it. That's the sound. So with them working together at home and the comfort of being able to go home afterwards, it's awesome. And I'm glad that they're at this point in their career because they deserve it for sure. So they start putting together, re-recording essentially the same songs I've heard, but on their own terms, which is awesome. The next song we get is August 2023. We get Take Me With You. And this is more of a sing-along. This is a great song. And I'm thinking, okay, you're kind of starting to get an idea of where the direction's going. Then we get It Won't Be Like This Forever. I love that song. I thought it was so catchy, more or less like a ballad of some sort. And you start to kind of see things take shape. And then in November, we get We Need More Bricks. And that is where my mind was, just blown away. I mean, it was just rad to hear that. I knew we were shaping up for a special treat here. The album gets announced. It comes out January 19th, not too long ago, really just 10 days ago, actually, from when I'm recording this. And you start to get the rollout. And this is what I love about Neck Deep. Like, they do this stuff so right. They had acoustic shows leading up to it. They had signings. Like, get out there and talk to the fans. Shake their hands, sign promo albums. A lot of bands don't do that stuff. And for fans, that stuff's really, really important. The album artwork was teased. It looked so sick. I mean, the artwork on it is incredible. They had the pre-orders. It's on cassette, CD, tons of vinyl. So as a collector myself, I mean, that stuff is just so rad, leading up to release. And then the album comes out. And this is something that I was just so looking forward to. I had this penciled in on my calendar, upcoming album, could not wait to hear it. And what I'm going to do is kind of go through each song track by track and just provide some of my initial thoughts. So the opener, Dumbstruck, Dumpf. These are very important. Neck Deep knows these are important, especially in the pop punk genre. I think it is imperative that you open an album with an absolute banger. And they did. This came out actually the night before the album released, and I was just blown away by it. And the production on this was just absolutely killer. The guitar riffs, it's like chunky power chords, they just sound so gnarly was my takeaway on it. And part of what I love about this band is I was wondering, are they going to play this stuff live? I had tickets to an upcoming show, really just a few days after release, their first show in the US. And I was thinking, they're going to play some of this stuff, but I didn't know where in the set list it would fall. And when I saw them, they opened with this. So to open the album with that, to open your US tour kicking off with that, I mean, that is a testament to A, how good the song is, how confident they are in it, and B, the fan base's super, super quick reaction to this. I mean, when I heard this being played, people were going nuts, myself included. So I thought it was a killer opener, great way to open up the album. The second song, so Sort Yourself Out. This is where, from a production standpoint, to me, I could tell this was a band that grew up with Blink-182 and New Found Glory as their heroes. And you hear it, and it is just pop punk perfection. I said it the day it came out, from the structure to the tones to the lyrics to the vibes, this is a perfect pop punk song. And what's fascinating to me on this album is it's not only calling back to their roots, but it's also not repetitive. It still feels authentic, it feels genuine, it feels modern, and it feels like they're still growing as artists. And on a lot of this stuff, especially in the pop punk genre, they call it cookie cutter. You know, you can go verse, chorus, bridge, slow down, build up with a snare, outro, you're done. They don't do that on any of this. And if you listen to the actual production and the instruments, there are so many awesome tricks on these where they don't repeat the same riff, or you think it's going to come in with guitar and it's just the bass, or you think it's just going to be a bridge, but it's almost like a bridge and then a post bridge and then a true outro. I mean, it's just really, really well done is the best way I can put it. This song blew me away, and really, even right now, like when I'm thinking about that song, that lyric has just been stuck in my head since I listened to it. And to be honest, it's not really much to do with that part. It's so good, so well done. So, you know, to start this off, you've got two back-to-back bangers. We get to This Is All My Fault, number 3. Love the little riffage at the beginning. To me, this kind of felt like the Peace in the Panic song. Like, this is something to me that I felt was a progression from that. Could have been on that album. But another banger. I think the drums there are killer. I know a lot of people maybe had reservations about a new drummer, or you get ties to some of these band members as you've watched them throughout the years. And a lot of people, I think, were worried that, you know, Danny was gone. What are the drums going to sound like? But this chorus right here, I mean, won me over on the drums. Like, Palsy's rad. He is killing that. And when that chorus kicks in, there's almost like a little synth thing going on in the background. And then the drums, da-do-do, da-do-do, da-do, da-do-do, da-do. And the way he walks that in, I mean, gnarly. Great stuff. So 3 for 3, when I'm listening to this album, I'm like, holy crap. These dudes were not joking around when they said they were going to go back to their pop punk roots. But I think it's very, very important that it did not feel repetitive or stale or rehashing old ideas or trying to recapture those days or anything. It was still very much neck deep in 2023, 2024 release date. Number 4, we get to We Need More Bricks. This is an absolutely amazing song. I mean, this has angst. It's a banger. When you get to that bridge, I mean, if you don't want to just raise your hand and hit a 2-step, I don't know what to tell you. When I heard that for the first time, I was thinking, when they play this live, they're going to slow down that bridge and they're going to go through that a couple times and they're going to let people go nuts. And when I just saw that live, I mean, that was one of the highlights of the show. It was so, so sick. Obviously, I love talking Blink-182. You all know that. Mark Hoppus himself, Ben was on his podcast or radio show, After School Radio, on Apple Music, and he said, Mark did, that this was his anthem for the year, like, can't stop listening to it. I'm the same way. I mean, this song, when it dropped, it just raised my eyebrows. I could not wait for this album to come out. You know, we just had 2 months. It dropped in November, bit of a lead up to it. 5, Heartbreak of the Century. So I love this song from the get-go, from the very first time I heard it, and it was so hard because I heard it during the music video basically being made. And I want to say, like I said earlier, I think that was November, and it didn't drop until February of the next year. And I just kept humming that affectionately, you fuck me over. I could not wait for everybody to hear this song. Now, the good thing is, when it dropped, I played it so much, but because I had known about it for some time, I kind of laid it to rest for a little bit. And so now that the album came out and it's back on there, it's right back there in my rotation, and I'm like, man, that is just such a great song. I'll get into some of the critiques, and the band agrees with these. I just saw an interview that they did. Some of this stuff, if I had to knock any of it, it would be that we got a lot of singles up front, but that's just how things are. So, when you get 4, 5, the one dropped the day before the album, when you have half the album before the album's out, not perfectly ideal. Ben said so himself, but that's just how things are done. So I'm not even going to knock anybody for that. The only other complaint that I would have would be just the 10 songs. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Ben addressed that as well, was pretty much in agreement, but I've got a good point I'll make on that as well. Go Outside. This is where, so side A and the side B, you know, it does kind of take a little bit of a turn here. You've got all the heat. You've got the bangers, like pop punk bangers, 1 through 5. And then we start getting into kind of some different vibes here. But Go Outside is one of my favorite songs on the album. And I love that Save Me chorus when he comes in there. I mean, I'm just like driving in my car just screaming that. People are probably looking at me like I'm stupid. But I'm really high on this song. Love this song. Number 7, the Take Me With You. So obviously in Blinkland, if you're following Tom, even going back to Aliens Exist, I mean, to me, this is almost like their Aliens Exist. It's the lyrics are just so great. Obviously, you can tie that in with the world is shit for the most part. Ben posts a lot about that on his social media. So to essentially like welcome aliens and say, take me with you. I just think the lyrics are awesome. It's a sing-along, very, very catchy song for sure. Number 8, track 8, They May Not Mean To. Now, I will say for me, this is probably the song I listen to the least, but I can see this song, the very first time I listened to it, I could see this being an anthem for a lot of people. And it's something that isn't necessarily addressed. I know that Ben talked about this in an interview where essentially like your parents are just people like you know, and as a parent myself, going through it with 2 little ones, you know, you have this picture painted in your head when you're younger of like your parents are superheroes. And then when you get older or you become the parent, I mean, a lot of days I just feel like I'm just trying to survive and stay out of absolute chaos until bedtime, and you've kind of done your job for the day, and you realize that like, hey, your parents are people just like you, and they just tried their best, and we're going through the same shit that you're going through. And everybody's just trying to kind of navigate and get through this life as they can. So I thought the lyrics on this song were great. I thought that some folks could use this as an anthem for sure. It was a subject matter that I hadn't really heard addressed like this prior. So I think it's a really, really cool song. I like the meaning of it and the lyrics behind it for sure. We get to number 9, It Won't Be Like This Forever. And this is something that, you know, I think I've seen them refer to it as a ballad. It's kind of a soft, more catchy sing-along song. And when I heard this, I'm like, this is beautiful. Like from the picking at the beginning to Ben's vocals. One of the lines that I just cannot stop repeating ever since I first heard it was that I am the rain and you're the petrichor. I had to Google petrichor, but now that I know what it is, I love that line so much. I just think it's super poetic. So this is another just awesome sing-along song. But to me, it is kind of the tale of 2 sides, and I think that's cool to get that in an album. Up front, we've got the pop punk bangers. On the back, we've got kind of more alternative sing-alongs, maybe some different vibes going on. The last song, The Closer. So I think if these are the 10 songs that they had for this album, obviously this one I think slides in as a closer. This is Moody Weirdo. And I really like the lyrics on this. And of all of the songs, this is really the only one that I see that probably could have fit on All Distortions. It's a similar vibe to me. So I thought it was a great way to close out the album. Again, if I had to pick a complaint, and I love this album, and I've bought it like 15 times. I've got every single press coming, the CD, the cassette. I love this album. Easily album of the year for me thus far. I haven't been able to stop listening to it to even give Alkaline Trio or Green Day the time of day. The only complaint I have, if I really had to, is the shortness of the record. But I will say this. I interviewed a band called Driveways, who I love, and they made a really good point. I asked them, because they tend to roll out 4 or 5 song EPs, and I asked them, you know, what's the reasoning behind an EP? And they said, you know what, a lot of times we start with, let's just write 3 or 4 great songs. And a point that their drummer Ryan made was, you know, we talk about how a lot of albums will have 12 to 15, 16 tracks, and there's true B-sides. And their opinion was, why even shoot for a B-side? Like, let's just bring the heat, and that's what we got. So I'm going to keep that in mind, when it strikes me that 10 songs may be a minimal amount to suffice my pop punk needs. But, the more I thought about it, I'm like, that's a great point. Like, why have 15 songs with 3 that people skip? Like, let's just have 1 through 10, bring the heat, short, compact album, and it is what it is. And Ben said in an interview I watched last night, actually, that, they had a couple more songs that maybe were going to make it. And ultimately, they felt that, the 10 songs would suffice. And there's a lot of pop punk or hardcore albums that have 8-10 songs, and it is what it is. So I really do not have any knocks on this album. I mean, from the rollout to the artwork, I think the production is absolutely amazing. For some of us older pop punk fans, it's fascinating to me how fresh a lot of this stuff can still sound from basically all of these bands that were inspired by Blink in 99, 2000. You would think a lot of these bands would have run out of ideas, or it would just all sound so similar by now. And a lot of it does. And that's something that for this band is very, very special to me, because I don't get that from them. There's bands I will not name, but I'm like, nah, heard that before, nah, cookie cutter, nah. When I listen to Neck Deep, like, there's a lot of thought that goes into this. I think the lyrics are fire. I think the guitars are fire. The bass tone throughout this album, I mean, whew, Seb was bringing it there. I think all around, when it comes to a pop punk record or just a Neck Deep record, this was well above my expectations, and I already had very, very high expectations because each album they drop, I love more and more and more than the previous one. So for me, I haven't even really thought about how I rate this in their discography. It's up there. I mean, it's number 1 or number 2 for me, for sure. But yeah, the new Neck Deep album is out. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I'm a huge Neck Deep fan. I think those dudes are awesome. They're super rad. They're super kind to their fans. Go out and see them on tour. I just went and saw them. They're playing throughout the U.S. for the next month-ish, I believe through February 25th. If you have not heard them live, you will have a blast. And that's something that this band just does so well that a lot of bands do not. A lot of bands, you'll find a good song, you're like, yeah, it's okay, and you go to the show and it's terrible, or nobody's moving around or anything. If you go to a Neck Deep show, you will not be disappointed. The last thing I want to touch on is I also really appreciated the fact that it was self-titled. And I want to ask them if they ever thought it was untitled. There's big arguments there in Blinkland on whether the 2003 album of Blink's is self-titled or untitled. It's untitled. But I'm curious if they ever hashed that out. But they've been referring to it as self-titled. It is Neck Deep. And this is something that I think I feel like every band should have one of these. It gets to a certain point where you kind of let the music speak for itself. And to me, they could have came up with several different names. Ben had mentioned they had a handful in mind, and ultimately it just felt right. And that's something that I think is really, really cool. At the end of the day, this is Neck Deep in 2024. And I think if you listen to that, and if you follow the band and you go see them live, I think it all lines up perfectly, and it just makes such perfect sense. So I was stoked to hear that for sure. So, okay, those are my thoughts surrounding the new Neck Deep album. I would love to hear your thoughts below. And if there's any other bands or albums you want me to listen to and talk about, I'm happy to. I love doing this stuff. So be sure to subscribe and follow the podcast YouTube page at 182 News Pod on Instagram. Talk soon.